After the devastating floods of 1862, the North Fork ditch along the American River had to be rebuilt, and playing a prominent role in that reconstruction, maintenance, and repair were Chinese immigrants, as recorded by payment receipts issued to them in 1863 by the American River Water and Mining Company that operated and owned the North Fork ditch. And there was over 250 man days attributed to Chinese labor, and I wondered how big was the Chinese presence along the North Fork of the American River over into what we know today as Granite Bay, because the North Fork ditch delivered water into that area. So what I did is I went and I looked at the 1860 census, and this is kind of what I found out. First off, let's look at the North Fork ditch. It started right below Auburn at Tamaroo Bar, and it came down winding along the river right out there and kind of terminated right above Beals Bar. But in this area right here through Dike 5 was the Rose Spring branch that delivered water to the Rose Spring area and up to Miners Ravine, as you can see on the map. But it delivered water through Rattlesnake Bar, Horseshoe Bar, Carrollton, and all of those areas. And so I kind of wanted to see what was the Chinese presence and the other people that lived in the area. So looking at the census, they do them by townships. And I found the 1887 map of Placer County that delineated the old townships. And so what I did was I kind of outlined those areas that I needed to look at that were along the North Fork ditch, because that was primarily a mining community. And you can see the outline kind of in that turquoise ever. Now, some of it is kind of, sometimes there's people that may have been out, I didn't grab them, and there may have been people that didn't really work in that area that were listed in the census pages. The aerial view, you can kind of see what the area encompassed. It encompassed from the river out there under Folsom Lake through most of Granite Bay, and then went up to Loomis, Newcastle, and South Auburn. And when you look at the census map pages, it will give you the township, the Placer County, and the post office. And that was real critical for me. I decided that within the townships, I would look at those pages that were serviced the residents from Folsom, which is actually in Sacramento County, and Rattlesnake Bar. And I would dismiss, post offices that were serving pages on residents from, Auburn and some of the other areas, because we knew that the people that lived in this area either went to Folsom to get their mail or up to Rattlesnake Bar. There was one page that listed Horseshoe Bar as a post office, but I don't know if that was an error or not. So in looking through there, I came across 29 pages, and that included 1,127 individuals. And then I took that information page by page, line by line, and put them into an Excel spreadsheet so I could do an analysis. And essentially, what it came down to when I was looking at all the different people and breaking it down, the US-born versus foreign-born population of this area, 64% of it, the people were born in another country. Only 36%, or 407 people, listed their birth in the United States. So there was a large foreign-born community along this mining area that we called the North Fork Ditch and the North Fork of the American River. Going further and breaking it down, I saw that of the adults, there were 309 that were born in the U.S. and 98 California-born individuals. So those were young people. They were all 10 years old and younger. And so people were having babies. And some of those California-born children were to immigrant parents that were born in France or Ireland or another country. We can see that 31% of the people of their birth were European or North American, and that would be Canada and Mexico in North America, and 33% of the people in this census review were Chinese, listed as Chinese immigrants. Now, there was one entry that listed a Chinese individual as female. I do not know if that was an error, but if we just leave it as is, that was 369 Chinese, and most of them were working adults. Did seem to be a few very young Chinese individuals, but most of them were working in the mines and were of an age where they could do manual labor, as opposed to some of the US-born and foreign-born individuals that were too young and they weren't in the workforce. Looking at the population by gender, we had 985 males and 142 females. Of course, most of the women did not list an occupation because they were just home. They were homemakers. And many of the females actually were young children. There weren't too many female adults. And this was a mining region. Even though in 1860 a lot of the placer mining had kind of dispersed, and they were, because of the North Fork ditch and the water, they were working on the cliffs, the canyon walls, to extract some of the gold dust. There was still some panning in, working of the riverbed, but most of that river gold had been taken out years earlier. So total, there were 671 individuals that listed their occupation as miner. And 51% of them were Chinese, or 343 adults. 328 were born in the US, Canada, Mexico, and 328 from Europe, which comprised Denmark, England, France, Germany, Ireland, Norway, Portugal, Scotland, and Sweden. Can you imagine just maybe walking down to the river, going into one of the villages at Carrollton or Doton's Bar? You would hear, more than likely, the language of these various immigrants: Chinese, Norwegian, French, Portuguese. All of these people just, they're talking in their native tongues. It must have just been an incredible period with all those people. Now, I tried to do the best job I could in taking that information on the occupations and transferring it to, a spreadsheet so I could break it down. And of the occupations that were listed by the people in the census, 75%, or 671 adults, listed their occupation as miner. There were 14% as other, 5% were farmers or gardeners, and it seemed that the Chinese and European men who listed their occupation as gardener probably were farmers, because the US people did list their occupation as farmer. So I think gardener and farmer were synonymous. And 6% of the population generally considered themselves laborer. They were hired out to go work on the North Fork ditch, build homes, they were carpenters, things of that nature. But what were the other occupations that people listed? And I went through and I calculated all of those. There were merchants and saloon keepers, cooks, blacksmiths, 2 school teachers, 2 steam engineers. And those were men that, understood how a steam engine worked, because they were still employing steam engines to run water pumps and sawmills, because there was a mill up on Whiskey Bar, so their services were in demand to fix the steam engines, make sure they didn't blow up. One gentleman listed his occupation as musician. There was one physician for all of these people along here. In looking at the occupations, when you go through the census pages, it doesn't list distance, it just listed township. So when they went from one dwelling to the next, you don't have an indication if that was 20 feet or 2 miles. So it's kind of hard to gauge how far apart the different homes, shacks were of the people and where they were across the landscape. But some of the people I was able to identify. William Lyons, he listed his occupation as a toll keeper. And William Lyons built a bridge from Carrollton, which is essentially at the foot of Granite Bay Beach, over to Condemned Bar on the other side of the river. He did this in 1856. The 1862 flood washed away the bridge. He moved that bridge up to the confluence of the North Fork and the Middle Fork, and that became the Lyons Bridge. But in 1860, he was living, it looks like, in Carrollton. James Martin worked a soda factory. We do know that there was a soda factory right around the curve out there at Rock Springs. So potentially his dwelling was in the Rock Springs area. Samuel Greenwood is a toll keeper, and I could never zero in, but I think he may have been a toll keeper for the Oregon Bar Ferry, which is very close to Auburn. He was elected a school superintendent in, I believe, 1859. And there's other indications he lived in South Auburn, right in the River Canyon. 2 women listed their occupation as washerwoman, and you can see Sarah West, she had 4 children to support, all born in California. And then one woman, Susan Madden, listed her occupation as saloon keeper, and she was born in Ireland. One of the ways I knew that I was really in the zone for the area that I was studying of the mining region along the North Fork ditch were several of the men listed their occupation as water agent or ditch tender, which directly relates to the North Fork ditch. And many of these names are on documents or referenced in documents from the American River Water and Mining Company. One in particular is David S. Beach, a water agent that lived up in Rattlesnake Bar. He was actually the cousin of Amos Catlin, who kind of organized the American River Water and Mining Company, and there are several letters of Beach to Catlin discussing the operations of the North Fork ditch when Catlin was the superintendent. Beach probably could have been the assistant superintendent if that was a title at the time. One of the disappointing aspects of the survey, even though there were numerous Chinese men listed, was being able to try and track them into different areas because the spelling of their names was phonetic and varied from person to person. I'm sure the census taker wrote you, one way. Someone else wrote it Y-O-U. I've seen it Y-U-E. So it's hard to know if you in a census on a particular page was the same you that was paid labor for working on the North Fork ditch, or one of the Chinese men who actually bought water from the North Fork ditch, because the North Fork ditch sold water to Chinese miners. And there are several sales reports. You can see on this one in Rose Springs, which was this area to the west out in Granite Bay, we have Ah Sing, Ah Fook, Ah Yung, Ah Gun, Ah Chan, and Ah Young. And that revenue from these Chinese miners was important to the North Fork ditch, because the North Fork ditch was, it always teetered on being insolvent. And then of course their labor was very important in shoring up some of the earthen berms for the ditch, working on dams, cleaning out the ditch so the water would flow. So they were very instrumental in the community, and there were Chinese merchants. So there was a large Chinese presence here in 1860 and in the early 1860s. and it's been largely forgotten, overlooked, because there aren't really many remnants left. On a few maps it'll say Chinatown here and there, but they did have a significant presence. They worked on the North Fork ditch to keep it running, and now we know that the Chinese played an important part in the mining here along the North Fork of the American River. And the next chapter is to find out where some of these men went, if the railroads pulled them away from this area, or if they just dispersed to other urban areas. Hopefully you have enjoyed this little historical segment on the Chinese along the North Fork of the American River in the early 1860s. I'm Kevin Knaus. Have a nice day.